Hello and welcome to Newsroom. I'm your host Maryam Zia. In today's show, we are going to discuss two topics. In first topic, we are going to discuss about the new wave of terrorism that we have been seeing during the past few days. And in the first Corps Commander meeting chaired by the new Army Chief, commanders have vowed to eliminate the threat of terrorism in the country. And they have said that we will be fighting against this menace of terrorism as per aspirations of the people of Pakistan. And in the second segment, we will be talking about the floods in Pakistan and how the flood situation has impacted Pakistan, and the United Nations report that has said that there was a stark reminder that changing climate will bring more disasters in the near future. So let's move towards the first segment of today's show, and let's watch a report that our team has prepared.
The surge in terrorism incidents in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan provinces, and more importantly, the botched suicide bombing attempt in Islamabad in which a policeman lost his life, has further complicated the challenges of political instability and economic meltdown. While the most significant threat is coming from TTP, at the same time, insurgents in Balochistan have also stepped up their attacks. Amid indicators that the terrorist threat may increase next year, the Corps Commander at their monthly conference at the General Headquarters resolved to fight against terrorists without any distinction and eliminate this menace as per aspirations of the people of Pakistan. ISPR statement indicated that the focus of military top brass discussion remained largely on resurgence of terrorism in the country. Soon after taking over the command, Chief of Army Staff General Asim Munir visited the western border and had reiterated the pledge to end the menace of terrorism at all costs, while emphasizing that no one will be allowed to spoil the hard-earned peace.
You have watched the report for our first segment. We will take a short break over here. Viewers, welcome back. And to discuss today's first segment, we have been joined by our first guest, Brigadier Retired Saad Mohammed Sahab, who is a defense analyst. Welcome to the show, sir. Sir, we are talking about the two-day conference, Corps Commander Conference, and the brief ISPR statement did not specifically mention if some new kinetic operation has been okayed, but its tone and almost single focus on terrorism threat put across a message that counter-terrorism would be the new leadership's top priority. What would be the contours of Pakistan's counter-terrorism strategy?
It's a good thing that the counter-terrorism, at least the resolve has been shown in the Corps Commanders Conference press release, that the terrorism in Pakistan will not be tolerated under any circumstances, and any terrorists who threaten the state of Pakistan will be wiped out. Now, that is the intent, and it's a good one. But we have not been told as to what will be the strategy, what will be the methodology for this. Because not only that, Pakistan's domestic law enforcement will be involved, the army being a backup to the civil law enforcement agencies, but also it has an external factor also. Most of these terrorists have their bases across the border with Afghanistan. And unless that issue is taken up as part of the overall strategy to deal with this resurgence of the terrorist activities, we will only be trimming branches. So unless we go for the source, which lies in Afghanistan, and the hub being there and the spokes being extended into Pakistan, and they have now threatened very sensitive areas of Pakistan. So that also has to be a part of the overall strategy, and the holistic view has to be taken, and our holistic policy needs to be implemented.
Right. We're talking about the holistic policy and holistic strategy, Brigadier Sahab. After KP and Islamabad were rocked by episodes of militant violence over the past few days, Balochistan also experienced a bloody weekend where security personnel as well as non-combatants were subjected to acts of terror. What's behind this spate of terror in Balochistan, and what are the prospects of TTP and BLA nexus?
You know, the nexus between the BLA and the TTP exists, and the TTP has time and again given this indication that they work jointly with the Baloch terrorist organization and the Baloch separatists, who have also been very active in the past couple of months, targeting Pakistan Army personnel, the civil armed forces personnel, and also creating unrest in the sensitive areas. For example, in Gawadar, there is unrest. And I'm absolutely sure that behind this unrest, there are elements which are, anti-state. Though some of the demands will look very benign and they can be resolved, but resorting to violence for accomplishment of one's demands, I think, is not acceptable. Moreover, the LA terrorists as well as the TTP terrorists have the powers within the neighborhood. They've been provided, financial support, especially even when the previous government was in this nexus between our enemy and the forces there, and huge amounts of money in Pakistan. Not only that, even from Iran, if you look at the arrest of Indian Navy, Jadhav, he was operating under a Muslim name from the Iranian territory, and he was caught in Pakistan, who had come here to organize the terrorist activity. So we must have, a policy which must look into all these factors. Just military operations or intelligence-based operations within the territories of Pakistan, yes, they are irrelevant. They must be wiped out wherever we find them. However, the external links have also to be cut. And there are examples available to us where terrorists have been wiped out by going for the source of the terrorism. Because unless we wipe out the source, trimming branches will give us a temporary relief, but it will not be a long-term solution to the problem that now exists.
Right. We are talking about the source of terrorism, and local police is very important in this regard for the security purpose. What do you think should be the training facilities provided to the local police to fight this menace of growing terrorism?
First and foremost is the political backup to the police force. The other, in the last couple of decades, we have made the police so politicized that even if they take action against terrorists, they have been, people who have been suspended. I'll give you the example of the recent Islamabad terrorist attack. Now, the police lacked training. Number two, they went up to the vehicle, which meant that they didn't want to fire on the vehicle because that maybe they would have suspended. Now, when you identify a terrorist, and this was the policeman on the ground to identify whether a man is a terrorist or not, if he has disobeyed the orders to stop, then deadly force can be used against people. An ample warning, and then force is authorized to the police personnel on ground. Now, going up to the car to check whether they are a terrorist or they are not, I think that is violation of basic training terrorism. Minimum 50 yards, the policeman should have ordered those people sitting in the car to come out. And had they not come out, then deadly force should have been used. Number two, if you look at the present situation in Pakhtunkhwa, there is a government which is not motivated to deal with the terrorist activities. Most of the time, they are on the verge of dissolving the assemblies and going away. Now, which government which is on the verge of being dissolved would give the police force a backup against such terrorist forces? The police being the front line, they must fight. There is no tribal territory now. They are all part of the settled territory. Now, it is up to the government of Pakhtunkhwa and the government of Balochistan to deal with terrorism. Now, if they want backup, then they can request the federal government, and the Pakistan Army or the civil armed forces will be available to those governments as a backup. But the law and order remains a provincial subject, and it is primarily their duty to ensure that the areas within Pakistan remain safe.
Right. Right. So when we talk about the peace in the country, peace is indispensable for the economic stability of country as well. So what do you think is going to happen in the next few days, and how the resurgence of terrorist violence is detrimental to the economic calculus of Pakistan, and given the current situation of economy? So how this is going to impact the economy of the country, and how are we going to fight against it?
Now, that's the aim of the terrorists, and the backers of those terrorists also remain within the region. Are some of our enemies who don't want our country to progress, will arming and providing support to such terrorist activities and such terrorist groups. Now, the primary aim of these terrorists is to create a sense of insecurity and create instability. All this. Now, please tell me, in an environment like this, in which our federal capital is not safe, and terrorists have managed to enter and carry out a suicide bombing, the local investors will not come forward to invest. What to talk of foreign investors? So, at the moment our investors are not coming forward, that puts our economy under severe stress. Moreover, the political instability that exists in this country, and for that I blame the politicians, that they have created such a atmosphere in this country where the people don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Whether the provincial governments are going to be there, or whether the federal government is going to be there, or whether there are going to be elections, or whether there are going to be no elections. There are rumors going around of national government and technocrat governments. Now, these must be, these rumors are detrimental to any economic activity in this country. And unless that stability is given, Pakistan's economy will continue to slide, and we may get into a meltdown situation. So it's for the government and the provincial governments, the federal government as well as the provincial governments, that they must come together for the sake of the country and ensure that our economy does not sink. Because even if the opposition comes into power after an election, if the economy continues to go down like this, they will also suffer. They will also not be able to revive the economy in an earlier time frame. So it's in the interest of the country, it's in the interest of the political parties that they create a sense of stability in this country.
Right. So all stakeholders need to come and sit. Right, right. Thank you, Brigadier Saad, for joining us. And it is important that all the stakeholders come to sit on one table for economic stability in the country. Viewers, we are going to take a short break here, and when we come back, we will be going towards the second segment of the program. Welcome back. And recent floods in Pakistan were a stark reminder that the changing climate will bring more disasters in the country. And we will be discussing this topic in second segment of the show. Our team has prepared a report. Let's watch it.
Catastrophic floods, droughts, and record heat waves in 2022 have shown that climate change warnings are increasingly becoming reality. It has been almost 5 months since massive rains along with apocalyptic floods struck Pakistan, inundating a third of the South Asian country, and thousands of victims are still lodged in tents, shelter camps, or a long highway across southern Sindh and Balochistan provinces. The United Nations 2022 Year in Review report on climate and environment noted that this summer's floods in Pakistan were a stark reminder that changing climate will bring more disasters in near future. Using devastating Pakistan floods to warn about further disasters, UN report emphasizes the need to cut fossil fuel use to support developing countries in dealing with man-made climate changes causing droughts, floods, and extreme weathers. A recent study by World Met Organization shows the heat waves will occur more and more frequently into the 2060s. United Nations Chief Antonio Guterres warned world leaders at a climate summit in Egypt in November that humanity faces a stark choice between working together in the battle against global warming or collective suicide. UN Climate Conference in Egypt established a funding mechanism to compensate vulnerable nations for loss and damage caused by climate-induced disasters, which has to be operationalized sooner.
Viewers, you have watched the report. We have been joined by Ahmed Rafi Alam, who is an environmental lawyer. Thank you, Mr. Alam, for joining us. Sir, what do you think? Is the world taking measures to curb global warming or sleepwalking towards the collective suicide?
Well, thank you, first of all, for having me on the show. You have to understand that climate change or global warming is caused by greenhouse gas emissions. And greenhouse gases are what trap the sun's heat in the atmosphere, raising temperatures. Greenhouse gases are produced whenever we take something out of the ground and burn it for our energy or our transport needs, whether it's petroleum, whether it's diesel, whether it's coal, whether it's wood. Greenhouse gases are produced. And as a result of these greenhouse gases and associated global warming, the Earth is, on average, no more than 1 degree centigrade, about, on average, warmer than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And even at this 1 degree centigrade, we are seeing catastrophic climate events around the world. You know, Pakistan and the floods this year are just one example where 30 million people were displaced. But in the African country of Chad this year, there were about 3.5 million people who were displaced. Anyway, the international response to capture or to control climate change has been the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which seeks to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions so that the world's ecosystem doesn't lose balance. You have to understand this balance is very important because the world's ecosystem sustains our lives. It's the air and the water and the food that we have that allows for civilization. So to stabilize greenhouse gases, they've operationalized the UNFCCC. However, the UNFCCC is dependent on countries reducing their greenhouse gas emissions so that global temperatures don't rise more than 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. Right now, and you're asking me whether we're going towards collective suicide or not, the commitments the international community have given under the United Nations Framework Convention do not amount, or rather they exceed 1.5 degrees, which means a catastrophic amount of climate disasters in our future. And so at some level, it does seem like we're walking into collective suicide because countries are not reducing their greenhouse gas emissions at a rate that is sustainable for the Earth to continue. You know, the fight is ongoing. People are still trying to make sure that international commitments from different countries to reduce greenhouse gases will ensure a temperature warming of no more than 1.5 degrees this century. But those efforts have to be ramped up to prevent catastrophic, and I repeat, catastrophic worldwide disaster because of climate change.
Right. So a loss and damage fund has also been formulated for the vulnerable communities, vulnerable nations. What has been done so far for the early release and operationalization of this fund?
Well, you can't get the loss and damage facility that was approved this year at the Conference of Parties at Sharm el-Sheikh is merely a step or an indication towards the future. What has happened is that the international community, the United Nations Conference of Parties under the UNFCCC have agreed that there will be a sum of money collected so that countries that are suffering the ravages of climate change through no fault of their own, and this is why the Pakistani floods are so instructive, because up to 70% of the intensity of the rainfall in Balochistan and Sindh was on account of the 1 degree of global warming that we've experienced. Make no mistake, this was a man-made disaster for which Pakistan had no part to play. And so there needs to be a fund where countries like Pakistan, like Chad, like Nigeria, like the Philippines, like Mexico, like so many other countries devastated by climate disasters can get funding to put their economies back on their feet. But funding, and this is important, that does not come with any terms and conditions, which is not a loan. This is money owed to the global south on account of the greenhouse gas emissions emitted by the global north. And that's why it's an important indication. But that's all it is. You have to understand, right now, the UN COP has just announced that this fund has been declared.
Right.
There's so many
So, Mr.
questions.
Alam, right. Mr. Alam, what is going to be the mechanism of this fund and how this fund is going to help Pakistan and vulnerable countries like Pakistan?
Well, thank you for asking that. It's a very, very good question. You see, there's so many issues involved in operationalizing a fund like this. The first and foremost is, where's the money going to come from? You know, money for climate financing has been low so far. And to be optimistic about all of the sudden, just because they've announced a loss and damage facility, that money will come rushing into it, is to be a bit optimistic. But nevertheless, if you can cross this particular hurdle, there are plenty of other issues as well. For example, if you have such a facility, which countries are going to pay into it? And what mechanism, what calculations will be made to assure that how much they pay? You know, how much does the United Nations, or sorry, the United States or the United Kingdom or Spain owe internationally, historically, for their greenhouse gas emissions? These are calculations that have to be agreed upon. Equally, and equally difficult, is countries that seek these finances, seek this loss and damage facility, have to have transparent mechanisms in place so that people can see that the money that is being paid is going to the right causes, to the right people, and invested in sustainable and resilient infrastructure. So there are plenty of questions that remain unresolved. However, under last COP, the agreement was that a loss and damage facility would be created, and by next year, there is an implementation committee that is supposed to iron out most of these difficult questions that I've just highlighted so that the fund can be operationalized next year or beyond. And so, once again, please go on.
Right. So, what kind of climate diplomacy is needed to convey the sufferings of victims of floods and climate on these conferences and to early release of this fund and for a good mechanism of these funds?
I know you keep on coming back to the funds, and I know the destruction caused by the climate disaster this year is in the billions of dollars. You know, the United Nations has said that Pakistan's reconstruction costs for, you know, the roads and the schools and the hospitals and the dams and infrastructure devastated by these floods is somewhere in the region of $30 billion. That's an immense amount of money. And so Pakistan's climate diplomacy needs to continue to leverage this position of loss and damage so that we can move closer towards having countries pay into the fund, but at the same time, and this is so important, because the entire point of the UNFCCC is actually not loss and damage. It is to reduce greenhouse gases so that essentially a loss and damage fund is not needed. So climate diplomacy in Pakistan must also insist that large countries, big economies, reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, move to sustainable and more renewable energies. And so Pakistan's climate diplomacy needs to retain its momentum, but diversify the voices that it's making right now to ensure climate justice.
So what has been the response of international community regarding the funding and technical assistance to Pakistan?
You know, I'm a bit disappointed actually, because when the floods came, the United Nations called for a flood relief fund to be established. This is not a reconstruction fund. This is a relief fund for the immediate needs, for the housing, shelter, and food for the millions of people that had been displaced. And initially, the United Nations called for $130 million as relief. But then, when the United Nations Secretary General came and visited Pakistan and saw the extent of the devastation, increased the appeal to about $800 million. Now, unfortunately, not more than $300 million has been paid into this account. Now, I don't want to sort of question the generosity of the countries that have paid into this flood relief account, but I just want to remind you 300, less than $300 million. When just a few years ago, when Notre Dame, the church in Paris, burnt accidentally, nearly $1 billion were raised in less than 2 weeks. You know, the war in Ukraine is costing billions of dollars a month. It appears to me that there is money around the world to finance war and aggression, but not enough, unfortunately, to support people who are suffering climate injustices.
So what kind of measures are needed by the countries, by the vulnerable countries, to fight against this climate injustice?
You know, the United Nations system is very interesting. When you go to one of these conference of parties, the conference of parties who have signed on to the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, of which there are nearly 200 participants. At this UN level, every country that's a member has one vote and one veto. And what this means is that countries like Pakistan or Vanuatu or Jamaica have the same strength as countries like the United States or the United Kingdom or France and Japan. It is an equalizer, these diplomatic cops that they are at some level. And so the diplomacy that's needed from less developed countries, from countries that are suffering the brunt of the climate crisis, is to cooperate, to form together and to raise their voice at the conference of parties. You know, if you have more than 100, 150 countries voting on a particular issue, it's incredibly difficult for large countries to avoid a decision like that. So small and more vulnerable countries like Pakistan need to leverage their diplomacy to have a singular voice at these conference of parties, so they may extract, if I may use the phrase, their pound of flesh from the global north for the climate injustices that they have been receiving.
Right. So what measures are needed by these vulnerable countries to raise this voice so that these funds are released early to these countries and they can utilize for the sufferings of their communities?
Again,
what measures are needed?
There are so many things. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But at the same time, even if there's a loss and damage facility, countries that are vulnerable to climate change can't rely entirely on the generosity, not the generosity, but the culpability of the global north in order to protect their economies from the ravages of climate change. Countries and their economies, less developed countries and their economies, must invest in adaptation and resilient infrastructure moving forward. And this is instructive for countries like Pakistan. We must review our policies on, for example, subsidizing the construction sector, the real estate sector, or giving subsidies to the fertilizer sector. We need to invest in things like better farming so that when the temperatures increase, our wheat crops and our food crops don't decline. We need investment in projects that provide flood relief and flood protection. We need to retrofit our cities so that there won't be heat wave destruction in them. There's so much to do, and it requires a reprioritization on the part of many countries like Pakistan to reprioritization so that we are climate safe and climate resilient going forward.
What measures at policy level are required by Pakistani government to fight this climate injustice?
Well,
and to prepare ourselves for future, floods or future climate disasters?
Well, Pakistan is very lucky and unique in many ways because we have a climate policy, a federal climate policy from 2012, and actually national legislation, the Pakistan Climate Change Act from 2017. We're one of the few countries in the world that has not just a policy, but a law on climate change. We need to operationalize the National Climate Change Act of 2017, which envisages a climate change authority that will implement national policies on climate change. We haven't done that yet, even though the law is more than 5 years old. At the same time, many climate initiatives regarding reduction of greenhouse gases, such as transport sector, energy sector, or adaptation, such as irrigation or agriculture, require provincial governance and provincial governance reform. So far in Pakistan, only 2 of our 4 provinces have their own climate policies. We need to have climate policies at the provincial level that are coordinated with the federal climate policy. And beyond that, we need to bring climate change down to local government as well. Because no part of Pakistan, you see, all parts of Pakistan are affected by climate change differently. I live in Lahore, and the vulnerabilities of climate change here are very different, say, from Bhakkar or Quetta or Karachi.
So
We
how
need to
are we going to coordinate these efforts in all the provinces with the federal government for a comprehensive policy and for comprehensive implementation of these policies and laws?
most importantly, at so many levels, I feel that climate and environment initiatives in Pakistan have been handed over to foreign funded and multilateral assistance donations or lending. We need to mainstream climate governance. We can't leave it to the foreign community to fund our climate resilience. We need our political class to be able to step in and say that this is where the money needs to be going. We need to stop investing in things like overpasses and underpasses in places we don't need them. And we need to put that money, our own political capital, so to speak, into climate resilient projects. And what I'm saying, therefore, is that the political class has to take far more ownership of the climate issue than it has so far.
In addition to ownership, do you think we need some capacity building training of the concerned staff and officials?
Certainly. No, I might say that at the federal level, when the Ministry of Climate Change is doing an excellent job on its own, but like I mentioned, so much of climate governance is actually a provincial subject. And here the capacity is vastly lacking. I know there are two provinces that have their own climate policies, that's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Sindh, but Punjab, the most populous province, doesn't have a climate assessment at all. And this is very dangerous. It's almost misgovernance for such a large province not to have any sense of climate change and the risks it has towards it. And the same is true also for Balochistan. And these capacities need to be enhanced almost immediately. You know, right now there's no climate policy in Punjab, one of the largest provinces. And so we need to step up beyond these political imbalances, the political ripples of nowadays, to really see what the issues that face Pakistan are. You know, we have these political challenges that don't seem to align with our climate realities. And that's why I keep on repeating that the political class has to take ownership of this. Otherwise, climate change will be not just climate disasters, but also misgovernance.
Right. So do you think that the current policies that are in place on paper are sufficient to fight this climate injustice in future?
You know, policies are fantastic to have, but are flawed almost all the second they are passed, regardless of how up to date they are. And so I appreciate the fact that the government of Pakistan has many policies, including a policy on climate change. But our policy on climate change is from 2012. It's 10 years old. It hasn't, you know, it needs to be drastically updated given Pakistan's new socio-economic challenges. So yes, there's plenty more to be done. And once again, the political class has to take ownership of this issue to really apply the resources of this country where they're needed.
Of course. Thank you so much, Mr. Alam, for joining us in today's show. Viewers, that is it for today's show. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for tuning us. I'm signing off. Take care and Allah Hafiz.